The interesting thing is that the historians are always getting up and saying, it's just sort of impossible to avoid this question of having poetry or story creep in. I never heard a poet get up and said, it's a real problem for poetry. History sometimes sort of is creeping into my verse, and I don't know what to do, because it really, it's not a problem. We don't have that problem. So I'm a historian as well, and I love it, but I never heard a poet express anxiety about that. That's a good thing. Well, we'll eat that too, we're omnivorous. We'll come back to Henry, but I think that's interesting at any rate.
I want to second that as a poet, but I want to point out that one thing going on in this speech is that this is a king who's also a poet, and there are lots of kings who are poets, from Gilgamesh to King David, etc., through the years. This is a man who is enjoying his rhetoric. He's enjoying his speech, and he's building the rhetoric of the speech. He's even enjoying the meter. When he finally says, Crispin Crispians, he's doing it for the meter, and he's enjoying the repetition of the word. And he's also a man who's saying, we're doing this because we're going to be remembered. And the thing I've been saying for a couple of days here is to remember, whatever else you do, that poetry and history have the same mother. Their mother is memory, mnemosyne. And she's a fickle mother. She's a difficult mother, and she is as much made of imagination as she is made of anything else. But that's what he's enjoying here. And this is where the epic poet, the lyric poet, the dramatist, and the historian are absolutely dancing around the same thing that we refer to as truth.
Can I? Oh, go ahead. If that's the case, what do you make of Aristotle's claim then? What's the memory that's behind philosophy or behind the eternal? If obviously memory is behind the particular of history.
Yeah.
What's being remembered then in the
thing
universal?
about Aristotle is that he's serving a terrific purpose by creating these generic definitions, and he's being very, very, very helpful. But just as with his definition of tragedy, you notice that tragedy evolves and there are differences. There's a difference in Shakespearean tragedy and Sophoclean tragedy and all that sort of thing. So the generic difference between history and poetry that he's distinguishing there is true in a way, but not true in other ways. Sometimes poetry is more involved with particulars, and sometimes history is involved with universals. And also, his notion of a hierarchy, that poetry somehow or another should be placed above history, seems to me to be total balderdash. That says the poet, because
Traitor.
We really are, we are children of the same mother, and we are dancing and singing around the same truth.
Clio was the chief of the Muses, which is Calliope. Calliope, I mean, yeah.
Because of her beautiful voice.
Yes.
Well, I wonder if the Aristotelian phrasing here isn't really looking at what Max Weber would call, who seems out of place in this conversation, but he wandered in. Ideal types. That is that there's really not any such thing as history that is pure history without any admixture of poetry, and I think vice versa. But I think what you do have is history that is poetical in character, and I don't mean by that fanciful in character. I mean that it is some of the most beautiful historical writing and most breathtaking and convincing and Susan Bauer brought this up in her first lecture, that the extent to which the presentation of evidence fulfills a rhetorical type. So it gives you the sense that historical events have a beginning, middle, and end, that they have a kind of symmetry to them that we don't always experience in our actual experience of the world. And then there's, I think, poetry that is maybe more historical in character, more tied to particulars, to particular events. In a way, the Homeric epics, it could be said to have that kind of tie and any kind of narrative poetry. So I don't know whether this advances the discussion or not, but it does seem to me that the thinking in terms of these as ideal types that mix together in different ways may be a useful addition to the discussion.
So, Rob, we saved this for you, and you won't sit in it. So we thought you would sit in the middle and be our moderator, because we left this for you, and you don't want to be seen with us. And so that seems troubling. That just has gotten us off to an uncomfortable
Someone who
start.
doesn't want to die in our fellowship need not join us, right?
Yeah, that's exactly, well, band of brothers and sisters. But I actually...
Be happy for you.
Right. I did want to make I made a really good comment by bringing him up here. That was really good. I think my second comment is good too, though, because I don't know who is in possession of oratory as a human achievement. And historians in other eras, or historians of other eras, have had better material to draw on in oratory than historians who will write about our time, I think. And the New York Times, like, I don't know, 20 years ago, when PowerPoint first came forcefully into the world, the New York Times took famous units of oratory and turned them into PowerPoint presentations. So Gettysburg Address and Martin Luther King at the Washington Memorial, vision bullet points. Children of slave owners to have lunch with children of, so, sorry, this is not going, anyway, so that was very interesting to see great oratory turned into bullet points on a PowerPoint slide. And now that's all we can aspire to is a good PowerPoint slide in many situations. So the power of oratory, and I think that's where I melt with yearning in watching that. I've watched it 2 or 3 times now. I think, could someone exhort me to be more than myself in a manner that would be stirring to me? And would I want him to exhort me to die soon after? Maybe not, I might not want that, but just to see someone using words, and that's where I guess I'm back to the who, is poetry got some claim on oratory? And, okay, well then, and historians used to really dine out on that, on great quotations from leaders. That was one of the great things of the sometimes scorned, but often rightly celebrated era of the great man, was that the great man spoke well. And when he spoke, you thought, there is more to us than there was before he spoke. So that is my main thought in watching this, is thinking, could you come back, Henry? Could you just be, and maybe exhort us to do something kind to our neighbors rather than die well. Maybe we could make a mission to the French or something that would be helpful to the French who will resist it. So anyway, but I was really struck by how much I just melt and think, could we have that? And well, I'll leave that. Could we have that? Question mark. That's where I'm heading.
I think one has to have it. It has to be in that kind of situation. I don't think it could be. You could get oratory to, I don't think you could get. I don't think oratory of that kind for, let's say, eating your vegetables will work. And I know you're not talking about eating vegetables, but I mean, I have a problem with this scene every time I see it. And the problem is that I start to weep and my hair stands on end. And at the same time, I curse myself for that, because I know about what that, what Henry V was actually doing in France. And Shakespeare does too, because you have that earlier scene in the play where Henry is cobbling up some kind of legal justification for going over into France and killing a whole bunch of people. I mean, but it's also the same play in which he has his old friend Bardolph hanged for pillaging a church. So Shakespeare is well aware of the fact that this is a deeply morally questionable thing that's going on. And yet the oratory works. And it seems to me that, that what's going on is a kind of conflict between various kinds of values. And I think, what's his name, the guy who talks about hate, Jonathan Haidt, is interesting here, because he says that there are, there's the virtue of fairness, and there's the virtue, virtues of compassion, but there's also the virtue of just solidarity. And we're not going to be able to have a society unless you have a kind of passionate commitment to brotherhood, to we band of brothers. How can you not weep at that? Even if it's in a ridiculous cause.
I was just going to add, in total agreement, not only is the excuse for the war sort of cobbled together, it's sort of a weapons of mass destruction excuse for war, or a Gulf of Tonkin sort of thing, let's just go kill people, but he's also the man who orders his soldiers to kill their prisoners in the course of the Battle of Agincourt. And that scene, I believe, is left out of the Kenneth Branagh film.
Yep, but it's there.
There's one other thing that is so much harder to put your finger on, and that is to say, how can you be revolted by a war story and sort of exalted by it at the same time?
Yes.
And this is a feeling we have with Homer and a feeling we
Yeah.
have with history. He begins to play by saying, "Oh, for a muse of fire," and it's as if he's reaching into that Greekness somewhere in his past.
Tragedy. Tragedy.
that
He's reaching for the
sense
tragic. The
that
tragic.
Sometime or another, you're just going to have to fight a bloody battle, and it's going to have to happen in order for something to be resolved.
Yeah, if I may jump in at this point with the regrettable task of being the philosopher, because everyone loves a philosophical analysis of poetry. It doesn't kill the beauty of it or bore you to tears. And then I also am a guy who does a lot of work on Plato, whom poets... Well, anyway, when poets read Plato... Yeah, and you mentioned Homer. But I think that a couple of comments here that... I'll just say this straight up because we have to be brief, right? But I actually think that in Plato's Republic, he's not saying poetry is bad. I think he's saying the misreading of poetry is bad. And that if philosophy offers something to the study of poetry, it is precisely addressing the question that you raised. As you said, with Homer, right? So the point is that do you read Homer and you get out of it, if I'm strong enough, I can weep and mistreat people and take whatever I want, and a great king will kiss my hands after I killed his son. That is what is best in life. Or are you to read it and say, there is justice in the world, there's something profound and powerful about the humility of Priam, there is a kind of grace and charity at work somewhere in there. I know I'm using Christian terminology, but you don't have to take it that way if you don't want to. So how are you to distinguish one from the other? And so in any event, I think this is something that philosophy in its best sense tries to contribute to poetry. And I'll say maybe three quick things about this. One is that the speech is incomplete, unfortunately, right?
He edits a lot.
Yeah, and there's a whole part where he says, "By Jove, I am not covetous for gold." And he says, but if it is a sin to want honor, to covet honor, then I'm the worst sinner around. By Jove. And then he switches to talking about God, but the Jove part is cut out completely, right? So there's this drama in it between the pagan and the Christian going on, which responds to what you were talking about, right? That why is he there? Because he is the greatest sinner when it comes to coveting honor, right? And honor almost in the way Aristotle understands honor, which is I want to be respected by others. Not honor as in I want to be an honorable man. So... But then you have the band of brothers, which I think you rightly said is the part that makes you want to start weeping. And I think that Aristotle is often a good compadre to Plato. In this sense, Plato sets up something, Aristotle responds. And when Aristotle talks about poetry, he also comes to this question of oratory that you raised. And oratory, bear with me, I'm sorry for this. But oratory in Aristotle's understanding, or rhetoric in Aristotle's understanding, means that you are a friend to the audience. He says, so you can inspire anger in an audience, but a great speaker who gets you angry at the speaker is actually not a great speaker. A great speaker inspires anger by showing you that you are a friend. And he plays on an ambiguity in the Greek where to be friendly or to be a friend is the same word. And Aristotle says, what does a friend want? A friend wants the good of their friend for their own sake. The friend wants their friend to be virtuous, because that is what is good for everyone. And when Aristotle turns to the question of poetry and the poetics, which Rob offered to us, He says, what is it? What is really, like if poetry is an art, it has a product. What is truly its product? Is it just the written work or the spoken work? It isn't that. What poetry does through its rhetorical mode is that, this is lovely the way he lays this out, it actually heals the fractures in community. And it engenders philanthropia, the love of humanity, in a group that would otherwise be divided. So, and that's where you see the beauty of it, is in the beginning, they're fearful, they're scared, they're already talking about where are the men at home, and he brings them together and makes them into a real community. So once you have this, not that you necessarily need it, but this guiding light of philosophy, you can look through it and say, yes, the love of honor is problematic. The generation of community that poetry above all is great at doing, that's the noble part. And what Shakespeare is great at showing is that these things occur together, and they always could occur together. But the vice doesn't besmirch the virtue. The virtue can shine out, right? And final, and this will be really brief, but I think for Plato, he gets a bad rap for being really dry and abstract. But for him to understand the beautiful, he says if you understand it, you do it. That doesn't mean that if you have an abstract notion of it, you do it. He means your understanding comes in the doing. So you don't give someone an abstract definition of the beautiful. You give them this speech, and you internalize that speech, and that is your engagement with the transcendental. It occurs through the poem when you've been guided by philosophy.
That's very thoughtful. And I want to back up a little bit, though, from what was being said, because the question is, what did we just see? And we've leapt to a transcendental realm that I think it's useful when doing this, and I think it's very useful with students as well, to be really clear about what we just saw. Perhaps, I'm going to do it after, but we should do it before. We saw a clip of a film which includes things that couldn't have been done on the stage because of the movement of the camera and the costumes and the setting, which was edited from the original words, which are themselves in a play which is filled with historical liberties, shall we say, and which and compresses and transforms things. Furthermore, no one knows exactly which words were said. We're not seeing Henry, we're seeing Shakespeare imagining Henry. We're seeing an imagination of an act based upon loosely remembered chronicles and so on, but it's obviously a work of art. Henry did not speak in blank verse. For that matter, he may have spoken French. He may well have done it because, after all, he considered France to be his own. And it's an aesthetic object, and its purpose really was, let's not remember as well, to make money. And Shakespeare died a relatively wealthy man. The issue is that he did it so well and created so much delight in his audience that they kept coming back. They bought tickets, and it has had an influence that's astonishing. Somebody, I think it was you the other day, Wilfred, you said, isn't it interesting how all of these characters in these Sandal dramas and so on speak with English accents? That's Shakespeare. This is my pet theory, and I'm going to write about it someday. I think the reason for that is that Shakespeare literally invented this kind of imaginative act. In the first Henriade, in Henry VI, which was, this smashing success when he was a younger man, which we don't read much anymore, except for that famous line, first thing, let's kill all the lawyers, which is in part 2. That's in part 2, I think, of Henry VI. But I mean, it's literally so powerful that when we think about historical drama and imagine it, everybody speaks in an English accent. Why should people in Rome and Greece speak in English accents? Because Shakespeare did it, and he did it so well that that's the way we imagine it. That's why they even have English accents in Star Wars, which is basically the same genre, just set in a distant galaxy a long, long time ago. But the interesting thing here, perhaps, is that everything that we're discussing is based upon those sort of material facts. It's a piece of entertainment. It's an aesthetic object. These people didn't really say or do these things. In fact, they're very complicated characters. The virtue of it, perhaps, and the excitement is that Shakespeare, and this is part of his genius, actually gets us to believe that we're seeing these people. It's so rhetorically and oratorically compelling, for exactly the reasons I think you're describing, that we actually look right past that because the language itself is so irresistibly beautiful and powerful and clear. And that might be, I think that's perhaps, not to back us up too much, but that's a place to begin.
By the way, I think, Patty, I think
I want to go back.
Patty had a point earlier, and I wondered if you could come back to it, because I think, that there's still this issue of how our emotions can be going in one direction and our kind of knowledge of what is the right thing could be going in another. Could you, or have I got it wrong?
I think you got it righter than I did. So I think, okay. So I guess I am still locked on this question of how humans can communicate with each other in a way that unites in the community item that there, and maybe doesn't have to. I disagree with you on the, it has to be on the context of life or death for oratory to have an impact.
No, I think I may be wrong on that.
I think you are, to be frank. So, but you're right so much of the time that we were thrown off your trail there. So that's why we didn't notice. So, but I do think, I was going to see if I could say something oratorically powerful about eating vegetables, because you had used that as the example where oratory wouldn't be effective. And I believe I could do it, and I'm not going to do it, but I'm going to tell you how I would do it. My first husband had his first stroke when he was 48, and he was 56 when he died of a fatal stroke. So I have some reasons to think he did not, his diet, okay, so I could give a talk, and I have plenty of other friends who've been afflicted with that. I could give a talk about eating vegetables that would not be the 7 food groups or so on. I could do something. Yeah, but then I don't think I want.
More into the peach.
And I would definitely want to have fruit in the story as well, right? There's supposed to be a lot of sugar in fruit. So I went into a very solemn and somber framework of life and death there, just to make that point. But I do think that there is a yearning in human beings to be called into some wider form of allegiance and activity and achievement, and emotion is at the core of it, but it's also nice if you are being pulled. It's nice if you're not being pulled into that zone by a demagogue.
Oh, yeah.
That's much better. And so that
Wicklow is
question,
pretty good at this sort of
Would
thing.
it be fair to say that what you would like is something that draws us towards a we without having to create a they? That, right?
that's very well,
Of the French,
Yeah.
or the equivalent thereof, the
does
meat
it-
eaters.
Right, does it have to be us versus them?
Yeah.
Or
yeah.
could the us have such expansive borders that it starts
Yes.
as us versus them, and then it turns out everyone's, but I don't know where, I don't know where I got the notion. I think because at my age, I was born in 1951, I was a kid, and I heard that ask not what you can do for your country, or what your country can do for you, rather, just the reverse. I was speaking in 2020 terms and got confused for a moment here, so, but I was trying to quote from 1960, but I slipped around
Now
in time.
it's don't ask.
Don't ask, don't tell. So anyway, so I guess I do have reasons to have that yearning and to think that can happen, and that we can be called, well, Dr. King, I mean, it's not that we really have to, but it seems to have become such a rarity. And I guess my wildest proposal was that I don't know how we find the Shakespeare of the moment, but we certainly have some very fine writers, some of them sitting up here with us. And so could you be speech writers? Could you do something to help us? And the Democrats are, at least you won't have to work for so many of them, because there's fewer of them running for president right now. But is there something that a really trusted speechwriter with integrity could do to help us as a nation here? And again, I think that's a wonderful thing to watch, and a wonderful thing to read if I ever gotten around to really paying attention to the difference on that. So there's something that is inspiration in that, and that's what I guess you're right, I'm trying to get there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But we do use the term the moral equivalent of war, and we do talk about the war on drugs. In other words, the metaphor for really getting together and doing something has always been war, and can we do something about that? Can we rejigger the the human limbic system? I mean,
No.
I don't know.
He said no, I said yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to, I hope this won't, I think this follows on from what we've been talking about, but I think because we're all educators, we're all in the business of education, which is in part the question of what in the present and the past is valuable and important to pass on to those coming along behind us. I found these words just before the famous, we few, we happy few. He says, this story shall the good man teach his son. And there's a whole lot to unpack there. But the angle I wanted to explore, just to fit with Rob's framing of the whole discussion, is that story that the good man teaches his son more a poetical one or a historical one? Although it's certainly going to have admixture of both. I mean, it can't be a complete. It's not passing on the story of Zeus and the bull, whatever. It's not going to be a complete fiction, even an admirable fiction.
He's just trying to sell more tickets.
It may be a historical account that has fictive characteristics about it. That's shaped in a way that it could be meaningful. More meaningful than just the Henry Ford, history is one damn thing after another, sort of, that's a certain understanding of history.
Well, a slightly different direction, but let us not forget that one of the reasons, particularly if you've never seen that particular clip, or if you have, or if you're thinking of the Olivier, or if you're thinking of productions in your local communities, one of the things that makes that knock us over is the music and the film score. And it's a total playbook from Wagner, who taught us how to do this, even though there were no films in the 1850s yet, and no sound recording for quite another 70 or so years. But he taught us exactly how to take, and in this one it starts, if you go back and watch it, C major, you've got a timpani, very slowly. Then you've got an oscillation of basic chords in C major, and it goes for the first, 2/3, and off to E major, and pops up to this heroic harmony that's unrelated to C. It's sort of like turning a second floodlight on harmonically, but still very quiet. And then if we all went back and watched it again, just listen and tried to forget what the guy's saying, let's listen to the music. It is pushing him. I don't know who, whether he collaborated, whether the director collaborated. That's the beautiful art of film scoring. But believe you me, if we could pull that musical score out, it would work emotionally almost like the speech, especially if we knew the speech. We could reconstruct it in our minds. We could act it out. We could all mouth it out if we had it in front of us. Based on the music, we'd know where to put everything. And then, it's sort of extraordinary. Then, bingo, the tempo gets back in, and they're all off to war, and we're back to timpani serving. And, I just wanted to point out how powerful that is, and so quiet that you could barely hear it. And that's part of the power, except when we could hear it. Shakespeare was a genius at using music in his productions. There's a reference to over 100 songs in the body of the plays we have, specifically referenced, that are either sung, half sung, talked about having been sung. Music was used to undergird acts of magic. And we don't always know, but sometimes we actually do know what music was used, or at least what instruments, because we know who the players were. We know there was a harp and a theorbo, and there was the gamba, and there was a this or that. And then, of course, the way you'd expect it, trumpets and drums and things, and to make the transition. So if we're sitting back in Shakespeare's time and we need to get out of this bloody battle and go to the seduction of Kate, he would have, in these cases, had a musical interlude, the same way we'd all do right now if we were film score specialists. So the power of that, we almost can't find things that we see anymore where music is not playing a role in shaping our emotions, and he would, in my humble view, quite approve.
Carol, do you have perfect pitch?
So to speak. Absolute pitch is the way you're really supposed to say it, because it can get wrecked if you have a little too much wine, or but yeah, and it's a curse. It's not a blessing, by the way. If you have it, it's the curse. It's a curse, but that's not a play about that. So all right.
There's another way of reconciling what's going on musically and poetically and whatnot with what's going on philosophically too, because among other things, one of the things Shakespeare's doing is making a case for what might be a good king versus a less good king, or a better king versus a worse king. In Henry IV, Part 1, at the Battle of Shrewsbury, Henry is deceiving his enemies by having all sorts of people dressed in armor like his. So you have that great moment when Douglas is so furious at having killed Blunt that he says, I'll kill his whole wardrobe, And Henry here says, "It yearns me not if men my garments wear." And there's a sense in which you're being given a narrative about a king who has come through this education with the, in the carnival aspect of life with Falstaff, and who has come through other kinds of fire to be the man who makes, what look like all kinds of morally ambiguous gestures, from hanging Bardolph to ordering his men to kill the prisoners to, make your own list. But he's also the guy who says, if you fight with me, you are my brother. And there is that whole thing that Shakespeare's been playing with about the notion of monarchy, the notion of king, and the notion of a human being. And it's complex and contradictory, and it's working itself out dramatically, but it's kind of a marvelous product of the Renaissance and the introduction of an Enlightenment view of, that's going to influence the founding of countries like this one.
Are we, though, making Plato's argument in the Republic that we should throw the poets out of the Republic because they make us feel things they make us believe things that are not true? I mean, this kind of rhetoric was used pretty well by Hitler and Mussolini. At the same time, it was also used by Churchill. And in fact, the Laurence Olivier version of this was one of the things that pulled England through the Blitz. So, it goes both ways. Maybe we have to have that. Well, Bill was talking about thumos. We have to have that thumos, but it's dangerous.
In and of itself, there's nothing inherently virtuous about oratory or rhetoric. They are tools.
Yeah.
They are amoral, and Shakespeare knows this. He happens to use them brilliantly to explore those questions, but they are just, there's nothing is inherently moral about them, just as there's nothing inherently moral about a knife. It depends on what you do with it.
And if we can get really boring when the moral philosopher enters into the conversation here from this end, so as somebody who works on...
What are you implying, Brian?
What's that?
I said, what are you implying?
Yeah, well, you said it was bad when the philosophers came in. I'm saying it's worse when the moral philosopher comes in. Because it seems like a good man will teach his son that story. Well, maybe not. Maybe if it's an immoral tale, the good man ought not to teach his son that story. And this is the danger of poetic rhetoric, that he leads his men into an unjust war and then appeals to their vainglory and then says, why don't you pass on this moment to your children? I mean, this is Shakespeare writing in 1599 when there's no love lost for the French as well, right? So it strikes me, I wonder when somebody brought that up, can history provide a check on the danger of poetical oratory? Because I want inspiring speeches for the good. I don't want the bad man to be eloquent. I want the good man to be eloquent. And so does history potentially provide a check on leading us into these kinds of unjust, if you will, conflicts?
Can I respond to that very briefly? Because but Shakespeare himself provides the critique for it, all the way through all the Henry plays, and in this scene, too, with the killing of the prisoners. He's telling us, he's arousing us to that feeling of glory and sacrifice and brotherhood, and at the same time saying, look what this is in aid of, look what this is for. He's making us suffer that tragic internal contradiction.
But we watch that speech and the end of our hair raises, right?
It does.
That moves us, and we are moved by that sort of bellicose rhetoric.
But we've also been we've also been shown and told to our rational intellect that there's something bad going on here. So Shakespeare is actually saying, look, here are these two parts of yourself that are at war with each other. Now deal with it.
And that's where I'm wondering, is he providing history as a check to poetic rhetoric in the play itself?
Or is he providing how can I put it? He's providing poetic means to correct the possibility of danger of poetic means.
how poetic means, because it seems like he's providing,
The poetic means are in the other parts of the story.
right, which are well, I'm saying are like historical in nature. He's showing what happened as a kind of corrective.
Well, I mean, the scene where they cobble up that war is, well, actually, it is in Hollinshead, isn't it? No, I mean, it's in, it's in Hollinshead, I think. But,
Could I,
yeah.
Sorry,
I would like to hear Bill, and then I have a
Sorry.
short historical question, which I can't answer, so.
I just wanted to say, well, part of the reason I brought up that quote is that it also points toward the powerful motivating factor of those of us, the living, to live our lives, to conduct ourselves in a way that will be estimable in the eyes of those who come after us. And this is not, that this is something you see in, the whole notion of kleos in the Homeric poems and that sort of thing. So it's very much a part of, pretty consistently a part of human nature, it would seem. But that's a little different, I think, than what you're talking about. Is but it's very important. It's very important that, morally speaking, that we conduct ourselves in a way, or be conscious of ourselves as, there's this glib distinction that's made, I'm going to use it, between resume virtues and eulogy virtues. I think David Brooks came up with this or something. But it's useful here in that resume virtues are, went to Yale, graduated summa cum laude, so on and so forth. And eulogy virtues are what the things that are said of you at your death. The things that are, the estimation that those, your loved ones, your immediate family and friends and colleagues and so on have of you in a sort of eternal perspective. And so I think in terms of the stories that the Father will pass down to the Son, what will be said of you at this moment of decision? What will be said of you if you act this way rather than that way?
So I have a question which I cannot answer, but I have the impression that in Shakespeare's plays, when people go to war, the person, the king or whatever he is, lord or whatever, who exhorts them to go to war goes too. And he fights, and he could die as easily as everybody else.
Yeah.
And that would be true for Henry.
Yeah.
So that, to me, makes a really big difference in how I would evaluate the oratory. And I don't quite know what the philosophers would make of that, but I just think when somebody gives a speech from a very protected area and then other people go and risk their lives, that's a different kind of oratory than when somebody gives the "here we go" speech and goes the other way. Right,
Yeah.
that's right. Right, well, that's more common. But my understanding is that in Shakespeare, the leader could die and goes into battle.
And it always seems to me that he learned a great deal from it's a drama, but from circulating among his men the night before. Would that speech have been the same? Would he have touched the emotions in the same way? He was doing his research. There is human research, if you will, psychological research, and he took what he saw and felt from them and used it.
I wanted to respond to something, the conversation that was going on over there, which was there's this question of Shakespeare's morality, and there's this amazing essay that isn't read enough anymore by Tolstoy, published in 1906, where he takes on King Lear, but then goes after Shakespeare in general and calls him an amoral pig, basically. I mean, it's so aggressive. Now, I tend to side mostly with Fred on this, that Shakespeare is better than that, but if you want to see that argument laid out very thoughtfully and very powerfully, Tolstoy, man, it's quite amazing.
I guess my comment wasn't necessarily on Shakespeare, but on that scene right there, right? On that scene right there, if he's using, psychological understanding to lead his men into something that was unjust for them to do, then it's problematic, however committed he is. But
Oh yeah, really quickly, I just wanted to point out that, first of all, this has a history, right? As many of you may know, it was apparently performed by Sir Laurence Olivier to inspire troops in World War II. And obviously it's a bellicose situation, but something I really want to emphasize is that in the part of the speech which is the most inspiring, he's saying nothing about the French, right? He's talking about them and their community. And this goes to your question about he's going to fight with them, right? He says, "He who sheds his blood with me is my brother." And this again goes back to the Aristotelian thing that he says, "Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. right? So there's this sense of ennobling the people who are humble, and it brings back the Christian theme because Crispin and Crispian, these dual saints, are to be of tanners and shoemakers, people who are smelly and underclasses, and he's saying that the glory of virtue is open to us all in our community, and we don't need to make it about hating other people.